In the spring of 1846, Springfield, Illinois was buzzing with the fever of the West. Manifest Destiny was the drug of the era, and James Reed and George Donner were the ultimate believers. They were men of status, rich farmers and businessmen who wanted to trade the muddy streets of the Midwest for the sun-drenched valleys of California. "California is a land of eternal spring," George Donner told his wife, Tamsen, as they loaded their massive wagons with fine china, silk dresses, and thousands of pounds of supplies. "We will be kings there." They set out with 87 people, including many children. To the USA audience today, these are the original American dreamers. They weren't poor immigrants. They were families with high hopes, traveling in what were essentially the luxury SUVs of the 19th century. But their first mistake was already packed in their bags, a guidebook by a man named Lansford Hastings. Chapter 2. The Fatal Shortcut. By the time the caravan reached Fort Bridger, they were behind schedule. A man named Lansford Hastings had left a message. There was a new route, a shortcut that would shave 300 miles off their journey. James Reed, a man of pride and stubbornness, insisted they take it. "Why follow the old path when we can blaze a new one?" he argued. The seasoned mountain men warned them. "Stick to the trail you know," they said. But the Donner Party chose the Hastings cutoff. It was the most expensive mistake in American history. The shortcut wasn't a road. It was a nightmare of salt flats, jagged rocks, and thick brush that had to be cleared by hand. Instead of saving 7 days, it cost them 30. Chapter 3. The Desert of Salt. As they crossed the Great Salt Lake Desert, the sun became a physical enemy. The oxen, crazed by thirst, broke their yokes and ran into the wasteland to die. The families began to leave their precious belongings, the china, the books, the heavy furniture, on the salt flats like tombstones. Tempers flared. On a dusty ridge, James Reed got into an argument with a teamster named Snyder. In a fit of rage, Reed pulled a knife and stabbed Snyder in the lungs. The group was horrified. They didn't want to hang a father, so they did something worse. They banished him. They sent Reed into the wilderness with no gun and no horse, leaving his wife and children to survive without him. Chapter 4. The Sierra Nevada Trap. By the time the group reached the foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains, it was late October. They could see the peaks, the last barrier between them and the golden fields of California. "We must cross now," George Donner urged. "The clouds are gathering." But they were exhausted. They decided to rest for one single night at Truckee Lake. That night, the sky didn't just rain, it collapsed. A massive early-season blizzard slammed into the mountains. In a matter of hours, 5 feet of snow fell. The mountain pass was blocked. The 81 remaining souls were trapped. They were only 30 miles from safety, but it might as well have been 3,000. Chapter 6. The Hunger Begins. November turned into December. They built makeshift cabins of pine and oxhide. Soon the oxen were eaten, then the dogs, then the leather of their shoes. "Mother, is it time to eat the rug yet?" one of the children asked. They were trapped in a white, silent tomb. The snow was so deep they had to climb out of chimneys to see the world. And then the first person died. Bayless Williams succumbed to starvation on December 15th. He was the first, but he wouldn't be the last. Chapter 7. The Forlorn Hope. On December 16th, 15 of the strongest pioneers, men and women, decided on a suicide mission. They made snowshoes from oxhide and set out to walk over the mountains to find help. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. They walked for days with no food. On the 6th night, a storm hit.
They huddled together under a blanket, shivering so hard their teeth cracked. When the storm passed, 3 were dead. And then the unthinkable happened. Driven by a primal urge that overrides all morality, the survivors looked at the bodies of their friends. With trembling hands and tears freezing on their cheeks, they began to carve the meat from the bones. They labeled the pieces so that no one would have to eat their own kin. The taboo was broken. The Donner Party had entered the dark heart of human survival.
Back at the base of the mountains, by the frozen shores of Truckee Lake, the silence was more terrifying than the storms. The 81 souls were now skeletal shadows haunting the buried cabins. The snow had reached the roofs, turning the dwellings into subterranean tombs. Smoke from the fires rose through chimneys of snow, the only sign that life still flickered beneath the white desert. Tamsen Donner, the intellectual heart of the party, sat in her dark corner. She had been a teacher, a woman who brought books of poetry on this journey. Now she spent her days boiling the hide of an ox that had been dead for months. The result was a thick, glue-like slime. It had no nutrients, only the illusion of mass to quiet the screaming stomachs of her children. "Don't look outside, girls," she whispered to her daughters, but they all knew what was happening in the next cabin. The Breen family, the Murphy family, the Eddies, everyone was waiting for someone to die. Death was no longer a tragedy, it was a potential meal. High above them, the Forlorn Hope party was dying. Out of the 15 who started the trek, only a handful remained. They had run out of their meager rations days ago. Patrick Dolan, a man known for his jovial spirit back in Illinois, was the next to go mad. He began to strip off his clothes in the sub-zero wind, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, caused by extreme hypothermia. He died screaming about the warmth of a fire that didn't exist. The others watched him with hollow eyes. For 2 days they sat in the snow, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Finally, William Foster reached for his knife. They did not speak, they did not pray. They ate Patrick Dolan. The only 2 members who refused to eat were the Native American guides, Luis and Salvador. They were horrified. To them, this was a spiritual death. They fled into the woods, but they were weak. Days later, Foster caught up to them. He saw them as nothing more than meat. He shot them both in the head, the only recorded instances of murder for the sake of cannibalism during the entire Donner tragedy. While the families were starving, James Reed, the man banished for the stabbing of Snyder, was alive. He had made it across the mountains before the storms, but his heart was still in the snow with his wife Margaret and their 4 children. Reed spent months in the California valleys begging for help, but California was at war. The Mexican-American War had taken all the able-bodied men and horses. Finally, Reed managed to raise a small group of volunteers. "We are going into a white hell," Reed told his men. "You may not come back, but my family is in those mountains, and I will not leave them to the wolves." On February 5th, 1447, the first relief party began the climb. They carried 50 pounds of flour and beef on their backs. Each step was a battle. The snow was so soft they sank to their waists, but they kept moving, fueled by the hope that they would find survivors. On February 19th, the relief party reached the lake. They expected to see a bustling camp. Instead, they saw a white, smooth surface. Not a person was in sight. "Is anyone alive?" shouted a rescuer named Tucker. Slowly, a woman emerged from a hole in the snow. She looked like a ghost, her skin translucent, her eyes sunken so deep they were mere black dots. She looked at the men in their clean clothes and burst into tears. "Are you men from California, or are you from heaven?"
The rescuers entered the cabins and were greeted by a stench that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bodies were piled in the corners of some cabins, partially butchered. Children were gnawing on the bones of their own relatives. The rescuers, hardened mountain men, stepped outside to vomit. The rescuers could only carry 21 people. They had to leave the rest behind. It was the most brutal selection in history. "I cannot leave my husband," Tamsen Donner said. George Donner's arm had turned black with gangrene from a small cut. He was too weak to move. "If you stay, Tamsen, you will die," Reed told her. "Then I die with my husband," she said, her voice unshakable. She sent her daughters with the rescuers, watching them disappear into the white horizon. It was the last time they would ever see their mother. Among those rescued was little Virginia Reed. She was 8 years old. As they walked away from the camp, she saw a piece of human skin lying on the snow. She picked it up and hid it in her pocket, a grim relic of the world she was leaving behind. When the second relief party, led by James Reed himself, arrived a few weeks later, the situation had devolved into madness. The remaining survivors were no longer human. The most terrifying figure was Louis Keseberg. He had been left in a cabin with several children and the dying. When Reed entered Keseberg's cabin, he found the man sitting by a fire, cooking a pot of human liver and lungs. "Where are the others, Louis?" Reed demanded, his hand on his pistol. Keseberg looked at him with a grin that sent shivers down Reed's spine. "They are gone. They are inside me now." Reed found his own wife and children alive, but they were barely breathing. The journey back was a gauntlet of pain. They were hit by another storm that lasted 2 days. They sat in a circle, huddled together, as the snow buried them again. One of the children died in Reed's arms. They had to leave the body in the snow to save the others.
The descent from the mountains was not a victory lap. It was a funeral procession. The survivors were so weak that their skin would tear at the slightest touch. James Reed led his family through the slush and mud of the lower foothills, his eyes scanning the horizon for the green of the Sacramento Valley. When the group finally reached Johnson's Ranch, the first outpost of civilization, the locals were horrified. These were not the proud pioneers who had left Illinois. These were living skeletons. 8-year-old Virginia Reed, who had survived months of starvation, did something no one expected. She knelt on the green grass, kissed the earth, and whispered a prayer she had composed in the dark of the cabins. But the horror was not over for everyone. Back at the mountain camp, a few souls remained, including Louis Keseberg and the dying Tamsen Donner. By April 1847, the final rescue party reached the lake. The snow was melting, revealing the true scale of the carnage. Limbs, hair, and bones were scattered across the muddy ground. They found Louis Keseberg alone. He was surrounded by pans of human flesh. Tamsen Donner was gone. Keseberg claimed she had died of cold and grief, and he had eaten her to survive. However, the rescuers noticed something chilling. Keseberg was remarkably strong for a starving man, and he had a hoard of the Donner's gold hidden in his pack. "Where is Tamsen's body?" they demanded. Keseberg pointed to a pot on the fire. The rescuers wanted to hang him from the nearest pine tree. They believed he had murdered Tamsen for her money and her meat. But in the chaos of the wilderness, there was no court, no judge. They took him back to California as a prisoner of his own reputation, a man who would forever be known as the Cannibal of the Sierras. In a story defined by death, the Reed family was the anomaly. Against all odds, James Reed, his wife Margaret, and all 4 of their children survived. They were the only family to remain intact. Virginia Reed wrote a letter to her cousin back in Illinois that became one of the most famous documents in American history. She wrote, "Remember, never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can." The Reeds went on to become prominent citizens in San Jose, but the scars were deep. Margaret Reed could never stand the sight of snow again, and James Reed spent the rest of his life defending his honor, haunted by the ghost of the man he had stabbed on the trail. Louis Keseberg lived until 1995, but he lived in a prison of public hatred. He opened a restaurant in Sacramento, but no one would eat there. The rumors of his taste for flesh drove every customer away. In his final years, he was a broken, penniless man. He once told an interviewer, "I am a man who has seen too much of the truth of human nature. When the belly is empty, the soul dies first." He died in an almshouse, a pariah of the land he had suffered so much to reach. The Donner Party story changed America forever. It killed the shortcuts craze. It taught the pioneers a brutal lesson about the arrogance of man against nature. Today, if you drive on Interstate 80 in California, you pass through the Donner Pass. There is a massive monument there, a statue of a pioneer family. The pedestal is 22 feet high. Why 22 feet? Because that was the depth of the snow in that cursed winter of 1846. The mystery remains. What really happened to Tamsen Donner? Did Keseberg kill her? Or did she, as a final act of devotion, give her life so that others might live? The mountains keep their secrets. There are hundreds of descendants of the Donner Party survivors living in the USA today. They are teachers, doctors, and engineers. They carry the DNA of people who survived the impossible. The story of the Donner Party is not just a story of cannibalism. It is a story of the American spirit, the dangerous mix of ambition, stubbornness, and the ultimate will to survive. It reminds every American that the Golden State was paid for in blood, bone, and a hunger that can never be fully satisfied. If you go to the lake at night, when the wind blows from the north, some say you can still hear the sound of a child crying for bread. But it is only the wind, or perhaps it is the echo of 1846, a reminder that under the thin veneer of civilization, we are all just a few missed meals away from the wild.
The trauma of the survivors. By the summer of 1847, the physical hunger had been satisfied for the survivors, but a new hunger began, a hunger for peace. Many of the children, like Eliza and Georgia Donner, were now orphans. They were brought to the sunny valleys of California, but they carried the winter inside them. "Mother always told us to pray," Georgia wrote years later. "But in the cabins, when the fire went out, the only thing we heard was the sound of the wind. It sounded like people screaming." Psychologists today would call it severe PTSD. In the 1840s, they called it the mountain madness. The children would often hide bread under their pillows for years, unable to believe that food would always be there. They had seen their world turn into a place where a neighbor's body was a grocery store. This trauma didn't just stay with them, it leaked into the soil of California. As California grew into a state, the site of the Donner tragedy, Truckee Lake, became a place of macabre curiosity. In the 1850s, gold seekers and travelers would stop at the ruins of the cabins. What they found was haunting. They found half-chewed leather shoes, broken china plates with gold edges, and small splintered bones that clearly didn't belong to oxen. One traveler found a small locket belonging to Tamsen Donner. Inside was a lock of hair from a child she had lost years before in Illinois. These items were not just trash, they were the remains of a civilization that had collapsed in a single winter. The lake was renamed Donner Lake, but for the local indigenous Washoe people, it was a place of ghosts. They had watched from the ridges as the white men ate each other. To the Washoe, the pass was cursed by the hungry spirits of those who broke the ultimate taboo.
In 1847, Louis Keseberg did something bold and unexpected. He sued for slander. He was tired of being called a murderer and a ghoul. He sued a member of the rescue party who claimed Keseberg had killed Tamsen. The trial was a sensation in the young city of San Francisco. The courtroom was packed. Keseberg stood there, gaunt and trembling, defending his life. "I ate to live," he cried. "Is it a crime to want to see the sun again?" The jury's verdict was strange. They awarded Keseberg exactly $1. It was a legal insult. They admitted there was no proof of murder, but they made it clear that society would never wash the blood from his hands. Keseberg left the court and disappeared into the shadows of history, but his name became a curse word in the American West. Fast forward to the modern era. In 2004, a team of archaeologists and forensic scientists returned to the site of the Alder camp. They used ground-penetrating radar and chemical analysis of the soil. What they found was a shock to the historical world. They found thousands of tiny bone fragments. When they analyzed these bones, they found evidence of cattle, deer, horses, and even dogs. But they struggled to find definitive human DNA in the cooking pits. This led to a new theory that sparked a massive debate in the USA. Did the Donner families try to hold out longer than we thought? Did they reach the point of cannibalism only in the very final days of absolute desperation? It added a new layer of tragedy, the idea that they were heroes of endurance before they became symbols of horror. The Donner Party isn't just a story about eating people. It's a case study in leadership and ego. If James Reed hadn't been so arrogant, if Lansford Hastings hadn't sold a fake shortcut, and if the group had worked together instead of splitting into factions, they all would have lived. Every winter, when the snow falls on the Sierra Nevada, the rangers at the Donner Memorial State Park see it. The snow piles up, foot by foot, just as it did in 1846. It serves as a permanent monument to human fragility. America is a land built on moving forward, but the Donner Party is the story that forces us to look back. It is the dark shadow underneath the American dream. It tells us that no matter how many wagons we have or how much gold we seek, nature is the ultimate judge, and the mountains have no mercy.